What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so it is 12:30 in the morning right now, and I have recorded something like 7 or 8 audio files. I am exhausted. Spent all day today doing nothing but reading comics, and man, I need to get some rest. But PAX West is coming up this weekend, so I gotta prep ahead of time. So we are finally jumping into Blackest Night, and it is about time. I told you guys, the lead up to Blackest Night is huge. It's massive in scope. I mean, it's absolutely mind-boggling because everything we've covered really with the beginning of Green Lantern's Secret Origin all the way up to this point has all led to Blackest Night. So it's actually really exciting. But one thing I want you guys to keep in mind is that this comes as part of the aftermath of the death of Batman. Now, the way this all plays out and really the nature of Blackest Night is to kind of hit home at the idea of character resurrections. For those of you guys who are new to comic books, character resurrections were never really a thing until the death of Superman. And the reason why was because for the most part, when a character was killed off, they usually just stayed dead. There was really no sense in bringing them back. And it was really important for writers to follow that trend because whenever they wrote stories where a character died, there was a finality to it. It was the idea that, well, this character's dead now and they're never going to come back. The death of Superman and then the return of Superman basically cheapened it. It created the standard where it essentially said, so long as there's some kind of caveat, whether it's time travel, whether it's going into healing matrix, whatever it is, as long as a writer creates some sort of caveat, any character can come back. So Colossus, for example, sacrificed his life in order to cure the legacy virus, this virus that was just sweeping through the entirety of the mutant and even human community like a plague. And then following that, he was basically resurrected, by Joss Whedon. So this whole idea that the characters don't really stay dead anymore all really has its roots in the death of Superman. With Batman, he essentially died during Final Crisis. Now, of course, we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through this video, but the idea here is that we initially pick up with the Scarred Guardian. Now, we don't really know who the Scarred Guardian is. We just know that it's this Guardian whose face is scarred. Now, the reason for this is because this is one of the Guardians that faced off against the Anti-Monitor during the events of Sinestro Corps War. Now, keep in mind, the Anti-Monitor basically channels antimatter energy, whereas everything in the main DC universe is positive energy. In this story, it's just the idea that if positive matter is touched by antimatter, it'll begin to erode. And so that's why the Guardian's face is so scarred and so screwed up, is because it was basically touched by the Anti-Monitor, which began to erode its face away. Now, the response to this was that as this Guardian was essentially on the brink of death, it was suddenly met by the entity Necron, one of the many entities that exist as part of the emotional spectrum. Keep in mind, within the DC universe, you have the emotional spectrum, and the emotional spectrum is just a reflection of sentient life. And so as long as there are beings out there, alien, human, otherwise, who feel anger, who feel love, who feel compassion, whatever the case may be, that part of the emotional spectrum will exist because of the fact that it's fed by those very emotions. Likewise, because there are beings that exist, a time will come when they die. And so the Black Lantern Corps represents the concept of death. The idea is that while this Guardian was basically experiencing what amounted to near-death experience, so to speak, it was met with Necron because each of these different parts of the emotional spectrum basically has a kind of entity that represents it, which is to say all the emotion in the universe, all the fear, for example, in the universe coalesces into a being that embodies all the fear that exists in the universe. Of course, that being coming in the form of Parallax. These are how all these different things work. In the case of the Black Lanterns, the concept of death coalesces into a being called Necron, meaning that Necron seems to be basically undefeatable. So long as there's life in existence, Necron will never die, just because of the fact that, Necron represents the concept of something dying. Again, it gets really kind of crazy and really sort of mind-boggling when we get to these levels of thinking, but the cool thing is this is about as complicated as it gets. So the funny thing about this is that this Guardian basically gives us this sort of rundown of the history of the universe when it comes to these various lanterns, as well as, the manhunters that exist. So in order to follow this trend, it's pretty self-explanatory, but in order to follow this trend, what we know is that in the beginning, there was just the creation of the universe, however the universe came into existence. Following this, there was the very first race in existence called the Malthusians. And the Malthusians had basically evolved and grown to the point where they basically came to realize that emotion was the source of all problems in the universe. A person is struggling financially, they get angry, and in their anger, they get envious. In their envy, They take what somebody else has. This is basically the root of all evil, emotion itself. That's how the Guardians of the Universe viewed it. And so the Maltusians began the process of basically casting off emotion. Now, DC Rebirth comes back and ties into a lot of that stuff with Volthoom, providing a lot of information we didn't have before, and we'll cover all that once we get around to like Wrath of the First Lantern and different things like that. But the long and short of it for this video right now is that the Maltusians had basically cast out emotion and then began the process of creating this sort of universal police force, which came in the form of these android manhunters. Now, the problem with this is that these android manhunters eventually went awry. Now, this all ties into something called Krona's Gauntlet, which is to say a very primitive version of the Green Lantern rings, basically. And what we know is that Krona was one of the Maltusians, one of the Guardians of the Universe, who wanted to see the beginning of all things. And so the result was that when he did this, he effectively created all evil. He basically came, more or less went back in time and created the Anti-Monitor, leading to the collapse of the multiverse and all that kind of crazy stuff. But the idea here is that with Krona being a bad guy, Krona actually messed with the programming of the Manhunters, which in turn sent them on this murderous crusade. That's where the Red Lanterns come from and all those things. But in response to the Manhunters going awry, becoming evil, the Guardians of the Universe came to the realization that if sentient beings are what basically power the emotional spectrum, then the best way to tap into the emotional spectrum is to use sentient beings. But in order to do that, they can't just give them all kinds of crazy power. There have to be these sort of standards, these checks and balances that ensure that if a person is given a ring that allows them to channel directly into the emotion of willpower, that they won't use it for evil deeds. Now, of course, we know that Sinestro ended up doing that, but the idea was that the Guardians of the Universe created the Green Lantern rings and then had them go out and seek people who were deemed to be worthy hosts. Thus was born the Green Lantern Corps. The issue with this is that along the way, the Green Lanterns had basically encountered Atrocitus, the first of the Red Lanterns. And Atrocitus, by, looking into the future, by casting different prophecies, had basically learned of something called the prophecy of Blackest Night. This idea that all these Lantern Corps would rise, all these Lantern Corps would go to war, some unknown dark force would come into existence, and then basically wipe out all emotion in the universe, and then wipe everything out, and all life would basically cease to exist. Because of the fact that this basically created a scenario where the Guardians of the Universe had to face the idea that their lives, their existence, were not under their control, they in turn chose to ignore it. Now, where a couple of the Guardians, Ganthet and Sade, where they were basically banished from the Guardians of the Universe for refusing to ignore the prophecy of Blackest Night, one of them, the Scarred Guardian, actually began the process of ensuring the Blackest Night came into existence. And so that's where a lot of this stuff ends up happening. It's basically gathering all these different things together, these different resources, pushing the Guardians, operating behind the scenes, moving them in the direction of ensuring that this war of the Lantern Corps, this war of light, begins to take place. And so what our story does is it actually transitions over to a guy named William Hand. Now, this is one of the reasons why it is that I said that with the whole Geoff Johns run on Green Lantern, that he would just kind of introduce a character, and this character would pop up in a little bit of a story over here, and then they'd never be seen or heard from again for like a year and a half. This is one of those instances. William Hand was a guy who popped up in The Secret Origin of Hal Jordan, and all we knew about him at the time was that he was just obsessed with the concept of death. Now, the idea was that with The Secret Origin of Hal Jordan designed to go back and retell Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern's origin story from the time he first appeared in DC Comics all the way up to the modern day, we ended up finding out that William Hand was there when Hal Jordan first became the Green Lantern. He's simply been operating behind the scenes the entire time. The question became, what is this harbinger of the Black Lantern Corps? What was he doing during this time? And that's why this is so cool, this tale of the Black Lantern, because it's basically the life and times of the first Black Lantern, the person who would basically usher in this corps that would try to eliminate all things in existence. Now, what we know about William Hand is, again, referencing this, little bit of history with his character, he was obsessed with death. What this tells us is how obsessed with death he was. It wasn't like one day he just said, you know what, I think death is cool. Instead, it was a gradual thing. It was him dealing with his family who were essentially morticians, or at least his father who was a mortician, watching the things that he did and becoming enamored by the idea of death. In the same way that people will fire up a video game and say, this is the greatest video game I've ever played, and I'm gonna play it all the time because it's the absolute best. William Hand loved death the exact same way. He was enamored by it. He studied it. He always wanted to be surrounded by it. He was uncomfortable with living normal human beings. Instead, he was more comfortable when he was surrounded by the dead. The result of this is that back when Atrocitus, the harbinger of the Red Lantern Corps, first popped up on Earth, again, Atrocitus had looked to the future and seen that a guy named William Hand was going to bring about this Blackest Night, this war of light. And so the result is that Atrocitus sought to eliminate William Hand. This led to the intervention of both Sinestro and Hal Jordan, the newest introduction to the Green Lantern Corps, working together and then taking Atrocitus out. Following this, William Hand just remained behind the scenes for the most part. The weapon of Atrocitus, this device that was able to channel Green Lantern energy, was essentially left behind. And in using this, what ended up happening is William Hand just sort of became this guy that was going through the process of trying to implement death everywhere he went. He's simply just obsessed with the concept of killing things. Now, of course, this leads to him donning his costume, basically becoming Black Hand. This, of course, references all the way back to the old school Green Lantern stories, where Black Hand was very much a minor villain of Hal Jordan. This expands on that, and it basically says this is the road that William Hand took that led him to basically becoming the harbinger of the Black Lantern Corps. Now, the other half of this is that because William Hand was operating behind the scenes the entire time that Hal Jordan was the Green Lantern, he was privy to all these different changes. So when John Stewart first popped up as the second Green Lantern on Earth, followed by Guy Gardner, followed by Kyle Rayner, the events of Emerald Twilight, when he basically began to channel all this fear, became a host for the living embodiment of fear in the form of Parallax, wiped out all the Green Lanterns. These are all the things that William Hand was seeing. He was watching them happen. The idea here was that he had seen more and more superheroes die more and more often. The issue with this is that each time, for the most part, they kept coming back. So characters like Digger Harkness, Ted Kord, Maxwell Lord himself, who was killed by Wonder Woman in response for shooting Ted Kord. All these different things that existed out there. The death of John Jones, Aquaman, or at least the perceived death of Aquaman. All these different things have gone into the idea that as far as William Hand is concerned, what is dead should stay dead. In his mind, death is really a living entity. People who die should not be allowed to return. And in his mind, with Superman having quote unquote died only to basically be healed, with Hal Jordan quote unquote dying only to come back after being taken by the Spectre, with Kilowog, with Bart Allen, with Barry Allen dying and then coming back to life during Final Crisis. Again, these are all the ideas that William Hand believes that death has been cheated. And so because of this, his goal is to basically find a way to begin the process of giving death the people it rightfully deserves. This coincides with his desire to just inflict as much death as he possibly can, to kill anything he can where he can. And some of the first victims are basically his family. He goes through and begins killing each member of his family, ultimately turning this device on himself. Now, the reason why this matters is because when this happens, it's basically him fully handing himself over to Necron, the entity of death. And that's really the way it works with these different Lantern Corps, right? I mean, for example, if we take the Red Lanterns, it was really Atrocitus just experiencing absolute rage over the fact that his family had been obliterated by the Manhunters. The result was that as he began to channel this rage, as he looked into the future and saw he was going to be the harbinger of the Red Lantern Corps, he fulfilled that prophecy by creating the Red Lantern Corps, by forcing the creation of a Red Lantern power battery and then a Red Lantern central power battery. It was just working through the emotion of rage. Every single Corps always has that one person that creates it, and that person goes through all these different steps and all these different processes, this journey of sorts that ultimately leads to the formation of that Corps. With William Hand, it's a little bit different. It's not like the Scarred Guardian shows up, basically spews this Black Lantern ring out, which in turn attaches itself to William Hand and says, you are going to be my harbinger for the Black Lantern Corps. It's not like the Scarred Guardian started spitting out all these Black Lantern rings and they all just started going around, because then the question is, who would they go to? This is basically the Corps of death. And so the only thing that really can be done here is for William Hand to begin the process of resurrecting the dead. And that's why this is so cool, is because at this point we switch over to the perspective of the death of Batman through the eyes of Barry Allen the Flash and Hal Jordan himself. Now, this is told from a variety of different ways, but when it came to the death of Batman, it's really more of a misnomer. Batman being hit by the Omega beams of Darkseid during Final Crisis was basically this idea that DC could essentially remove Batman from the landscape for a time and then tell a story of his eventual return. What ended up happening is Batman was just time displaced. That's all it was. He was thrown back to the very early days of humanity, and that was really it. Now, of course, this was DC's attempt to basically set the stage to go back and retell this grandiose story for the origin of Batman. In the end, it didn't matter because they rebooted like 2 years later. But the whole idea here is that from the perspective of Hal Jordan and Barry Allen, they don't know that Batman's all the way back at the early days of humanity. As far as they're aware, Batman is dead. Now, the other half of this is that Hal Jordan begins talking about the idea of how people respond respond to those individuals who have been killed. Keep in mind, when Barry Allen died, he died as a hero. He died basically saving the multiverse, and so there were all these different responses to his death, all these different ideas that people were coming back. People were saying, oh man, we have to celebrate the life and times of Barry Allen. For Hal Jordan, it wasn't that way. I mean, we talked about this a little bit ago. Hal Jordan's life has been mired in just controversy and struggle and strife. But as Parallax, he didn't die a hero. Nobody looked at Hal Jordan and said, oh man, that's so sad. This once great Green Lantern had a fall from grace, but we should remember him the way he used to be. Not at all. People looked at him and said, he's a bad guy. He is a villain. He died a coward's death. He went out like a madman. And that is the legacy that's been haunting Hal Jordan ever since. Remember, with the whole run of Geoff Johns' Green Lantern, when he originally started killing all those original Green Lanterns, of course, we ended up finding out that some survived, the Lost Lanterns, as they're referred to. But the idea is they look at him and say, you betrayed us. You tried to kill us. Batman himself, despite the fact that Batman and Hal Jordan were extremely close friends, when Hal Jordan became a villain and started calling himself Parallax, he betrayed the trust of Batman. And that was a trust that was broken that took time to reform. And so again, this is the whole, legacy that he's dealing with. This is the aftermath of the events that he's coping with. At the same time, Batman was only one of the more recent deaths in comic books. William Hand's goal is to essentially begin resurrecting all these guys, make them his Lantern Corps in an effort to start killing off all these different beings that exist all throughout the universe itself. So again, this leads into a massive calamity, which ultimately goes into Brightest Day, and it goes into, the whole like White Lanterns and all kinds of cool stuff. And this is when we start getting into the cool stories. This is when we start running into like the main superheroes getting lantern rings and different things like that, the White Lantern Justice League. This is when we get into all this crazy cool stuff. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.